Hello, everyone. This is David Cohen, Executive Director at the JCRC here in St. Louis. I am joined by a good friend, Ahmed Fawad Al-Khatib, who is joining us today to give us some insight on recent developments in the Middle East, in Gaza and Israel. As many of you know, a lot of information has been coming out about what I will phrase as a possible potential disarming of Hamas in the region. And just for some context, Ahmed has actually been in St. Louis to speak to our community, to talk a little bit about his story and a little bit about his insights on the region. And things that Ahmed and I actually talk a lot about are the future. Like what is actually possible, because it's something that both of us care deeply about. A future for Gaza that is better than what's happening now, and a future for Israel that is better than what's happening now. So, with that context, Ahmed, if you could just, tell us about your role, what you're doing now. You've been on tons of podcasts talking about this issue specifically, but a little bit about your role, a little bit about the story you generally tell to people to say, this is what I care about in this region and why. And then we'll get into the details of this potential difference maker in the region.
Certainly. Well, good to be with you. A great time we had earlier this year when I came out to St. Louis. So I'm based in Washington, D.C. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where I lead the Realign for Palestine project. So it's an effort to promote a rejuvenated pro-Palestine narrative away from armed resistance, away from the points of view that I feel have been immensely harmful to the Palestinian people and their just and urgent aspirations for freedom, emancipation, statehood, toward a nation building agenda and the pursuit of peace as a pathway to empowerment and self-fulfillment. I am originally from the Gaza Strip, which I left in 2005 as an exchange student 1 month before the Israeli withdrawal of settlements, known as the disengagement. I tried to go back to the Gaza Strip in June of 2006, but Hamas abducted an Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, in a cross-border attack that summer, and I was unable to return, coupled with escalating security concerns there. I was able to come back to the United States and ultimately receive political asylum status, for which I interviewed on the very day that Hamas violently took over the Gaza Strip and ejected the Palestinian Authority. That was June 14th, 2007. My family remained behind. I have two brothers and two sisters. My dad, who passed away 6 years ago, was a doctor for the UN refugee agency there in Jabalia refugee camp. My middle brother was a UNRWA doctor for the beach camp and other UNRWA clinics. UNRWA, of course, being the not so controversial UN refugee agency. My oldest brother is currently in Gaza right now. He runs the field operations for a large medical NGO. And I have stayed very close to Gaza and what goes on there. And my relationship with the territory, I would argue, has been bolstered by my departure. And that leads to October 7th, when I knew that the Gaza Strip, as we knew it, would unfortunately be decimated and devastated. I lost both of my childhood homes. Three separate Israeli airstrikes killed over 34 of my immediate and extended family members. I have been on a journey, nevertheless, despite the personal loss, and that even goes to the time that I lived in Gaza. When I experienced an Israeli bombardment that killed two of my friends and rendered me largely deaf in my left ear. The challenges, tragedies, the PTSD of it has actually been something that I harnessed to push forward and promote an alternate perspective that breaks away the vicious cycle of hatred, violence, incitement, revenge, rinse and repeat. And so I've been on a mission to capture the shifting attitudes within Gaza among the population that are not represented in the broader pro-Palestine discourse as it's promoted here in the United States and Europe and around the world in media, on social media. I see an opportunity. I see an opening amidst the devastation, the hardships, the heartache in Gaza, whereby the population has and is moving away from Hamas in massive numbers. The majority despise the terror organization for a variety of reasons that we can discuss later. And I hope to promote Gaza as the kind of the crown jewel, if you will, of the Palestinian people. An example, a compelling example of what effective Palestinian self-governance can and should look like. Of course, being radically pragmatic, which is my philosophy, um, working with Israel, working with diverse Jewish, Israeli, self-described Zionist audiences, but also working with rising Palestinian voices who want to promote a different future. All of that requires that Hamas be out of the scene, or Hamas be sidelined, or Hamas be disarmed. And so that's what I've been working towards. And that's what this book of mine, this short book, Hamas and its 2 million hostages, that just came out. It's 85 pages, deliberately short because I wanted it to be accessible. Most people don't read nowadays, or there's just too much to read. And I was hoping that this can speak to diverse audiences, pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, and just average audiences who are interested in this subject.
That is great. You actually, I love it. You made me feel like a real talk show host because you have a book to pitch. It's like we planned this, but no, we did not. This is something that is just kind of cutting edge information. It's like a pop-up podcast, and we're glad to do it. So I hope people really took to heart some of what you said about your story. It comes across especially impactful when you're in the room, and I know a lot of people we've had speak to you feel the same way. That being said, again, I just hope people understand your connectivity to both the region and the things that we both hope to happen in the future. So let's start there. We have been discussing for a while now options for the area. One of the issues that you just brought up is what can possibly happen without a disarmament. We've talked about, okay, if that's not going to happen, maybe there needs to be a safe zone in the yellow zone. And maybe that's a cooperative region between Southern Israelis who care deeply about this region and Palestinians that want a different life. All these things have been talked about. Okay. So now a game changer possibly over the past few days, actual disarmament. There's a ton out there to read. A lot, I get tons of stuff in my inbox. Some people totally discounting the deal. Read the fine print. Obviously, the president is very excited about this, really thinks it's something for the future. I've seen other people that are very optimistic. I've also seen opinions change over the past few days. Where do you stand on all this? What is actually something that you could see changing the game, but also what is some caution that we should be aware of? Because I've seen you write about it all, talking to people on the ground who are in the know. So share with us what you can a couple days later after really letting some things percolate. What's going on? What really is the potential for change?
So it's important to keep in mind that the language of the deal, in part, is meant to present Hamas not as a completely defeated, humiliated organization, okay? Because Hamas, at the end of the day, is trying to save face, is trying to slowly walk back from the tree that it climbed. And so we've seen references to the storing of weapons.
Mhm.
And the storing of weapons, the giving of weapons to a non-Israeli entity, B, are deliberate parts of the plan to avoid the symbolism of the scene of Palestinians surrendering to Israelis, the scenes of basically Hamas having to be saying publicly, we're giving up armed resistance. They're trying to couch what could be the beginning of the end of their armed resistance narrative in Gaza with talk of storage, we're doing this to save Gaza. I mean, this is all ridiculous, of course. They've destroyed Gaza. They've brought this upon Gaza. But I'm being very matter of fact about why the language. There's talk of disarmament, but we hear about storage, weapon storage. And even the storage is supposed to be turned over to the International Stabilization Force and the NCAG, National Committee for the Administration of Gaza. That's the technocratic committee, both of which have emerged out of the Board of Peace and the UN Security Council resolution that followed the October 2025 ceasefire that released the hostages and stopped the major operations of the war. And so that's on one angle. The other angle is that this will be a phase sequenced gradual implementation of the disarmament. Initially, we saw talk of just the heavy weapons, and that includes their few hundred the remaining rockets, the mortar launchers, the grenades, some of the RPGs, but it also critically will include the tunnels, mapping of the tunnels in parts of the Gaza. And it's actually believed that a lot of these tunnels are in the parts of Gaza that the IDF already controls, which shows you how even after many months of Israeli control, there are still tunnels that Israel doesn't know about in the very territory that the IDF itself is operating. So that's going to be very important just on its own. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about if implemented, Hamas is on its, I mean, Hamas is basically defeated. It can no longer threaten Israel from Gaza. Hamas cannot replenish. This is a very key point. They cannot replenish their dwindling supplies of munitions. There's no smuggling from Egypt. There's very little in the way of locally manufacturing. I mean, they can manufacture from unexploded munitions, from other items, from destroyed households. They can manufacture some weapons, but we're talking small scale ultimately. The Islamic Republic of Iran is caught up in its own conflict. They can't really give money to Hamas. Hezbollah is in a world of hurt and is stuck in a quagmire. The Qataris, they can't export their liquefied natural gas LNG ships through the Strait of Hormuz. They're not exactly eager to hitch their rides to the wagons to Hamas and send billions of dollars. The Turks are getting the F-35s and they want to try to have a rapprochement with NATO. And so Hamas is regionally, the region is different. Hamas doesn't have the options. Hamas locally is hated by the population. The only way it's still in power is through the power of the sword. Hamas is unable to really train. We hear about the recruitment of new kids, new teenagers, but
Mm.
they're paying them like $20 to $50 a day. They can't train them. They can't even have them shoot because they have so few rounds remain. I mean, a finite supply of AK-47 rounds or M16 5.56 rounds. They can't train them. So they're showing them YouTube videos, I've heard from some people on the ground, of how to actually use firearms. So that's where I think circumstances have changed and Hamas is now coerced into this action.
So,
I wouldn't dismiss it right out the gate. I would take it very seriously. Lastly, what
mhm.
I will say is 2 days ago, we saw a shift in the language coming out of the executive board of the Board of Peace, executive committee rather of the Board of Peace. Nikolai Mladinov said that after meeting with Netanyahu, after meeting with other mediators, Israel is not going to withdraw beyond the yellow line until the process of disarmament is complete. And now that actually includes the small arms and it includes the weapons of the families, the clans, the tribes, known in Israel as the Hamulas. And the idea here is actually, ironically, that last part about the clans, that was very widely received positively and overwhelmingly like with a big thumbs up by the population in Gaza, because for the longest time there has been resentment towards these powerful families that have arsenals of weapons that terrorize the local population. And so you cannot disarm Hamas, but leave a bunch of clans with a lot of weapons, and hope that you can have real civilian law and order. So that's what's on the table thus far, and that's what we're working with.
So a few questions, and let me kind of go back in order. So the recent positioning by Israel, is that going to be seen by some as an impediment? I've read some pieces that, this is a critique of that is this is the same game, for example, that Israel won't go along with this. Some people may see it as prudence, as, well, of course we have to stay right where we are until we see. This is the back and forth always. Two sides that don't trust each other, claiming that each other are the impediment. First question, how do you see that recent decision by Israel to make those kind of conditions?
Well, it's understandable that the Israelis would be skeptical. It's understandable that the other, not just the Israelis, but even elements of the Palestinian public or the Palestinian technocrats, there's this idea that Hamas may engage in some display of disarmament for that was always a distinct possibility. For the cameras, they'll have a few hundred AKs, a few hundred. Here's some tunnels. Yalla, come blow them up. Yalla, let's. Al Jazeera, the Qataris will play along and they'll go inside tunnels and they'll show Indonesian or maybe Kosovar troops or Azeri forces or Moroccan troops going into tunnels and rigging them up and blowing them up and Allah Akbar, look at this, we're disarming Hamas, yay. And I mean, that might happen. But is Hamas really giving up all the tunnels that can allow it to maneuver underground? Are elements of Hamas going to be so ideologically rogue that they'll keep, just 100 RPGs for good measure. They'll keep 200 AKs. They'll keep maybe 50 IEDs and grenades, and they'll just store them in a tunnel that no one knows about. And a year or two, we'll start seeing a small scale insurgency in Gaza against the new Palestinian security forces, etc. I suspect the Israelis will have their own parallel verification mechanisms in addition to what the board has talked about as far as working with private security firms, working with signature intelligence. That's the intelligence that monitors sensor using satellite and other sensors, inputs from sensors. You can even actually monitor when heat differentials, particularly in colder weather. Tunnels have they're hotter. They're underground. They're hotter. And if you have areas that have an unexplained emittance of heat amidst a otherwise colder area, you can actually narrow down the search for tunnels. So
Yeah.
I understand the Israelis being very cautious. My only concern is that the current Israeli government, and an overarching baseline in Israeli politics, they don't they didn't really expect Hamas to ever say yes to disarmament, and therefore, at worst, there could be an outright rejection and just politicking for the upcoming elections in October. At best, we might see a half-baked effort to honor the agreement and basically maybe continue or intensify strikes in Gaza that could cause Hamas to possibly back away from this deal, or that could cause the United States or Arab mediators to kind of take off the pressure from Hamas and say, why are we doing this if Israel is going to just do its own thing? So that's something to keep an eye out for.
Interesting. So a couple of questions came up from a couple of your comments. So first of all, you mentioned just a short while ago other factions that may not play along. And isn't that always the case, whether it is hostages, whether it is any agreement? There could be an agreement, but on both sides, there could be extremists in one government or factions that won't play along, that might launch a rocket or two, and then it's all dashed or possibly dashed. So I do want to talk a little more in the future about potential success, but for a second, it feels like the recipe for potential failure is still there. And I guess my larger question, you know, Eli Sharabi, one of the hostages, came to St. Louis and he spoke. And I think one of the most powerful stories he told, and this is just to exemplify the situation that you described. There are extremists, there are zealots. He described people that were holding him, talking to him, and saying, we're never going to stop. We're never going to stop. So it brings me to the bigger question you mentioned. It's a different region. Iran is dealing with their own situation. Qatar can't send the money anymore. So help us understand why now and what is real about it? Because is it simply that after all of these years, Iran being unable to send as much money or arms, which many of us have dreamed about, is that the linchpin that caused an ideological group to practically say, can't do this anymore? That seems a little hard for me to wrap my brain around, that the ideological conviction would actually meet some rationality of the checkbooks empty, or help us understand that. What's the reality? Is it a little of everything? There will be an ideological group that won't disarm. And then how do we even move forward? And again, isn't that always the problem with having another entity with all these factions and some won't go along? Tell us that picture. How does that picture make sense?
Absolutely. It is a fact that, I mean, disarmament is the first step to the broader transformation of Gaza. There will be some work of some need to engage in what you would call de-radicalization efforts, and that's a multifaceted effort,
Hmm.
multifaceted multi-year, even multi-generational work, but there are some initial steps that need to take place. But so stepping back to your point, I mean, it is possible for an power. I mean, I hate comparisons to World War II. Everybody wants to compare everything to World War II, but is it that the Japanese just dropped their ideology overnight and just completely disbanded that and I mean there were practical conditions that forced and
Or
coerced
yeah.
that surrender, if you will. And that is ultimately what happened with the PLO, was a combination of the practical conditions of having been expelled out of Beirut and Lebanon, and then the civil war in Lebanon, and then realizing that the Palestinian national project has hit a dead end and that Israel is here to stay, is what led in the late 80s and early 90s, and I mentioned this in my book, for the emergence of the pro nonviolent diplomatic approach elements, the dovish elements within the PLO, and that's why they decided to disarm as a matter of a strategy, regardless of what some of what happened with Arafat later on, etc. But I'm talking about that was more of a deliberate political decision that was preceded by practical shifts on the ground. Similarly, I think Hamas could very much so realize, and I've seen some of the literature coming out, they could, they might be thinking that this is a time for us to evolve into a political organization. This is a time for us to become a different player. It's like grow or die, evolve or die. They realize that they've hit the end of the armed
Hmm.
resistance effort in Gaza. They do very much so
Wow.
realize that at the leadership level. Now, the foot soldiers and the guys that held Eli Sharabi and the guys that did a lot of the horrible things on October 7th, these guys, I mean, some of them they might go rogue. Some of them they might fall in line. Some of them might feel betrayed, and some of them might also just like, what are you gonna do when you're asked to turn over your arms? Like, what are you gonna do when, like, do you want to be targeted by Israel? Do you want to be left out of potentially getting a job, getting a monthly salary, getting your house that was destroyed rebuilt? I'll also add that unfortunately, and this is tricky to say because a lot of innocent Palestinian civilians were killed by the Israeli military even since the ceasefire. But the Israeli military has kept up attacks against Hamas targets since the ceasefire, eliminated Izzeddin al-Haddad and a lot of their military commanders that might have been obstacles to the disarmament deal. That might have been the ideology. They were part of the last generation of the pre-October 7 generation of Hamas commanders. So I would not underestimate the potentiality for shifts. I mean, Hamas has been defeated and hurt, and yes, they wanted Gaza destroyed as much as possible to blame Israel, to delegitimize Israel. But at the end of the day, millions of people marching around the world, thousands of BDS resolutions and ceasefire resolutions, and the elections of Mamdani here, and ICJ declarations and ICC warrants, all of that in total and endless coverage on Al Jazeera worth billions of dollars of PR and elsewhere that didn't change the facts on the ground. Israel is in control. Israel is powerful. They're being squeezed. The yellow line went from controlling 54% of Gaza to now approaching 70% of Gaza. So that's one third of Gaza's territory still under Hamas control. 2 million people squeezed in there. Hamas, they're they're on the ground. They're having to run a very messy environment, using mainly brute force. Gaza is sustained now by an amalgamation of the UN, NGOs, and basically a small amount of the private sector that Hamas taxes to death. But that is not a way in which you can sustainably run Gaza. So that I think is the impetus for the shift. Where that shift leads is anybody's guess. I'm not going to sit here and tell you, like, of course it's going to lead to the de-radicalization. Of course, this could all, God forbid, I mean, I assign like a probability of like 2% of this, but God forbid, in the same way that Al Qaeda receded only for ISIS, which was like Al Qaeda on steroids to emerge, you could have a Hamas on steroids that's smaller but far deadlier that prevents Gaza from ever evolving and developing. However, I believe, because I stand by what I've been saying consistently for 2 years, which is that the majority of the population have not turned against Hamas for multiple layers. Some because of the consequences of October 7th. Some because of the totality of the last 20 years of Hamas rule. Some because of 30 years of sabotaging the two-state solution and the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, only to essentially come back around and realize that, yeah, you should actually disarm and follow political negotiations, etc. Some for the nearly 4 decades of Hamas's arc, the emergence of them as an Islamizing a secular society, the imposition of fear, the moving of the Overton window of what's allowed to say, Zionism and talking to Jews and working with Israelis and kind of criminalizing any contact with Israelis or Zionists. And then the final element of this is of opposition to Hamas is also the realization that the armed resistance narrative is, for a variety of political, tactical, geostrategic reasons, some ideological even, is a failed one that has, at least specific to Gaza, just specific to Gaza, is not the way forward. Like, even if you believed in armed resistance, that should have stopped in 2005 when Israel pulled out.
No, you segued perfectly into my next question because it's really a kind of three-pronged question. But one of the reasons I appreciate you speaking with us is because, look, we can read a million things by columnists, opinion writers in the US. There's not a lot of free press coming out of Gaza. You've written about that. And so to have some insight on the ground is incredibly valuable. So you have written a lot about what this moment does to the global narrative that in many ways is both supportive of Hamas as a justified effort, of course, blaming Israel for being the main, antagonist in all this, but also this idea that I've talked a lot about, which is normalization. It's always been a dirty word. It was a dirty word for extremists in the Middle East, as you know, and you've told us you get death threats from people that think your advocacy for normalization is a betrayal.
Mhm.
And that's happened to colleagues of mine over the years, people that have said, David, I can't work on this project because I'm getting threats, not always from people in Gaza, but from
Yes.
people around the world that think they
Yes.
know better than you or people on the ground. So look, part of my work is dealing with this kind of global opinion about Israel, and especially, and I think this is where the dissonance comes in, that so many, I'd say, more extreme voices say, no, normalization is a cave-in. It's a complicity with the demonic Israel. And yet I would say to people, if you actually sat people down like in England or France and said, what do you want? They'd say, I want these two peoples to get together and live together. That sounds like normalization to me, yet they will listen to an extremist or an activist say, nope, not 1 inch. Do not give in 1 inch because that's complicity. How does that manifest right now? Because, of course, we just had an election, many primaries around the country, primary right here in Missouri, and a lot of people leveraging this idea of any candidate's connection to Israel in any way almost being demonic or somehow
Being
murderous.
genocidal, and you're for
Murder.
apartheid,
Yeah.
and you're a settler colonist, and all the loaded words.
So what does this do that, for example, possibly Hamas could have this realization, as you said, that it's done. We need to do something different. And that, so is that going to end the global attack? Is that going, are, like you said about Japan, are people just going to like go home, take their marbles and say, well, if Hamas is given up, what more can we say? Or are they just going to continue beating that drum of resistance, of Israeli genocide? It's silly little things, but Israeli genocide, yet in the middle of the war, vaccinating like a million kids. It That doesn't resonate. Our job sometimes is to say, I'm not saying like every criticism of Israel is wrong, but some of this extreme murderous genocidal talk just doesn't resonate with those of us that work in the region. What's the future of that? And then we'll get back to some more questions about the kind of disarmament. But what does that global conversation look like now, given the potential reality of this?
So I wrote precisely about that a couple of days ago, in which I mentioned how I think this could have serious, I think positive, but also severe implications for the mass hysteria that followed October 7th, in which Hamas was largely normalized, was largely celebrated, was large. And this isn't to say every single pro-Palestine person, every single,
Sure.
that's not what I'm saying, but like, let's also be honest. I can't go in a mainstream pro-Palestine Arab or Muslim space right now and speak freely in the way that I am with you right now about Hamas. Even though I'm proud of my Palestinian heritage, I do this because I care about the Palestinian people. I do this because I genuinely am invested in seeing Gaza become the best possible version of itself. 44% of American Muslims just told Pew Research a month ago or 2 months ago that they support Hamas. And I think that's actually a severe undercount. From my experience, very sadly and tragically, I think it's more like 70 to 80%. And that's a problem. That's a serious, serious problem in our diaspora communities and in the conversations. And there's a lot of like this is part of why I started putting myself out after October 7th, because I saw a lot of seals had been broken. Hamas was being normalized as valiant, as resistance. The dead Israelis, the Israeli children and women and the elderly who were taken as hostages. My once beautiful Gaza being associated with a single worst day attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, being treated as this is for 1948 and this didn't begin on October 7th and the Palestinians in Gaza are oppressed and this and that. Like these narratives, I think, unfortunately, are going to have a reckoning when Hamas is basically defeated, basically surrenders through this disarmament, even though we'll pretty it up and we'll use terms like gradual phase disarmament and storage of the weapons, etc. I think that will show that 3 years after October 7th, Gaza's destroyed, tens of thousands are dead. The Palestinian National Project has hit a true dead end. Then just the casualties, the trauma, the fissures within Palestinian society. This is going to take generations to overcome the damage in Gaza. For what? Imagine if Hamas came out on October 7th and said, even if they didn't say we'll disarm, said, you know what? Actually, we think this two-state solution is good. We're willing to live side by side with Israel. These weapons, we're going to just take them and put them aside and not engage in any more warfare with Israel. And we think the future is cooperation and not war. And we would love to unify with the Palestinian. Imagine if they had just done that. Zero casualties. My family would still be alive. Tens of thousands of Palestinian children and women and the elderly would still be alive. Gaza would still have a better future. And look, imagine what that would have done to Netanyahu or his far right coalition. And imagine what the reverberation of the narrative around the world. Okay, fine. Even if you don't want to, Hamas did October 7th as horrendous and just a awful, awful massacre. Imagine if instead of normalizing Hamas, the pro-Palestine industrial complex and the extreme elements of the anti-Zionist movement that have basically merged seamlessly with
Mhm.
anti-Semitism. You can't just this whole like, oh, I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. That ship has sailed long ago. I'm not saying that anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic. I think there can be an intellectual case where someone can at least have the conversation, but the way in which modern day anti-Zionism is A, because people don't even know what Zionism means. Zionism means different things to different people. But B, the way in which it's promulgated, it's very much so like a gentler way of saying Jew, or like you Jewish guy. Like it's not about Zionists. So anyway, imagine if that instead of simping for Hamas, instead of supporting Hamas in the armed resistance narrative, it was actually like no, like Hamas, what Hamas did was wrong, but there's Palestinian rights and injustices and the two-state solution and like the coexistence. Or like we just want the end of the military occupation, not the river to the sea. All of Israel is occupied, even the Overton window on terms. Like the military. I now have to say military occupation because all of Israel's occupation to most people nowadays. So imagine if there was a very targeted application of outrage that was pragmatically deployed to harness the global energy towards pushing Israel not into accepting Hamas or not into saying you have no right to self-defense or not saying into you're genocidal maniacs who deserve what happened on October 7th, but saying actually we think that what happened to you is horrendous. Hamas needs to end the war it started, release the hostages, and marry. I was criminalized for marrying calls for a ceasefire with releasing of the hostages. And I went to UCLA and I met with university encampment protesters, and they were like, "Oh, well, actually calling for." I was like, "What? Why is it so hard? Like children and the Bibas family, like just call for the release. Why is it so hard?" They were like, "Well, if we call for their release, that centers the Zionist narrative." And I'm like, how about that centers human life and like you anti-human like monsters? Like you're monsters. You're not pro-Palestine. You're an so there's more to being anti pro-Palestine than being anti-Israel. Just wrapping up, all is to say that if Hamas were to move forward with this, if hopefully the Board of Peace and the Trump administration and the Israeli government if this isn't screwed up due to incompetence or due to nefarious activities, and even a partial act, just a few of Hamas's guys doing symbolically surrendering weapons, giving up this arsenal, I think it'll reverberate across the world. It'll invalidate the armed resistance narrative, even if some are going to continue doubling down on the armed resistance narrative, which I expect. But I
But
think then we can have actual ammunition to say you can't. They've been trying to out Palestinian Palestinians, but what are they going to out Hamas itself at that point?
so let me ask you this question, and we'll get back to some of the technical issues related to the handover of arms in a second. But, the other day, Yair Lapid gave an interview, and this is a hard question, but one of the things he said was, look, we we had a strategy and we needed to go after these people that perpetrated October 7th. And we've done that. And we've had a lot of success. And it's caused a lot of harm.
Hmm.
And there's nothing wrong with saying you're sorry or having some empathy for the situation from our side.
Hmm.
And you talked a lot about what would have happened if this had happened. Well, it didn't. So there was October 7th and there was a retaliation. Um, and this idea of still having empathy, is it going to be hard to say that that retaliatory effort by Israel and the war in Iran brought us to this point? Was that, in a sense, the right strategic move, even though it caused incredible carnage to the region? It's one of those things where no one wanted that to happen, but did that strategy actually bring us to this point? That's a hard question to ask, but I feel like I had to ask it.
Precisely, precisely. And, had it not been for, I mean, this is so incredibly difficult to even utter as an analyst and an observer because I do have skin in the game and I do have the personal dimension of the loss and the aforementioned hardships that my own folks have experienced. But yeah, it's like without the devastation of Gaza, without the elimination of Hamas, which of course, the way that it so thoroughly embedded itself throughout the population. I don't accept the Israeli narrative that says every Israeli and every Palestinian innocent death in Gaza is is because Hamas just embedded itself in civilian areas, and therefore every single loss of life is attributable to that strategy. I think Israel, just like any other military, have made immense mistakes. I think there have been war crimes committed in this war. Even though I've said that I don't know, like like Hamas was very intentional in how it carried out this fight. It wanted Israel to be sucked into an impossible situation so as to delegitimize the Israelis and promote this idea that Israel is committing genocide, is trying to annihilate Gaza. And some will say, well, Israel didn't have to oblige Hamas just because that was Hamas's strategy. Nevertheless, you can go back and forth, but I think multiple things are true at once. The degradation of Hamas came at a heavy price, and it ultimately got us here. But the way that Israel went about this war, I think, has created fissures that, unless followed up by serious efforts to I mean, first we need to just improve the facts on the ground in Gaza. We need to demonstrate that once, and this might take some time, but once the security threats, the legitimate security threats to Israel as a res as a result of October 7th, and even such that nothing like October 7th can happen again, if Israel doesn't really show that it's serious about now that Hamas has been significantly downgraded, sidelined, there's new apparatuses, there's something new, and therefore we're going to let Gaza develop and prosper, then I think that will compound the resentment and breed long-term fissures from which it's very difficult to see how you can have large scale, you might have pockets of Palestinians who are willing to engage and work with Israelis and develop healing and reconciliation as a viable pragmatic strategy. But on a mass scale, particularly in the absence of a cohesive de-radicalization agenda, everybody who lost family members, everybody who lost their livelihood, everybody who lost a limb, everybody who's disabled, the hearing losses, the disability, the just the PTSD, the internal concussions that people have, the CTE from all the bombing that people have experienced, it's going to also like generate a destabilized society that has some violent tendencies, that has I mean, forget just the relationship with Israelis, just even the internal dynamics among the society are
Right.
going to be domestic violence, the relationship to children. But I remain hopeful and a believer, and some say that I'm naive, and I don't think I'm naive. I really think this with all my heart, that Israel's interests in Gaza are purely security, and that had there been a real answer to the security question before October 7th, such that Gaza was not a perpetual citadel for smuggling and arms and rockets and tunnels and Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamism and Muslim Brotherhood and all this garbage, I don't think Israel would have opposed a serious renaissance that would have actually turned Gaza into the jewel of the Palestinian people. And just because some people will counter that, well, Ariel Sharon's real intention with the 2005 withdrawal was to forestall the possibility of a Palestinian state because he wanted all the settlements to happen in the West Bank, etc. Just because somebody set a trap for you doesn't mean you walk right into it. Just because you see a bear trap when you're walking in the woods, you go around it. You strategize around it. You don't walk right into it and say, you see, so and so set a trap for me. So, like, that's my philosophy. And that's
Yeah.
where I think focusing on the post Hamas era as one of immense promise, as one of immense opportunity, is where I am putting my hope and optimism. And again, based on what I've seen from my interactions with Israelis, not just not just the left, but the center right, talking to Israelis in the security establishment, in the think tank world, talking to mainstream folks who are traumatized and upset about what happened to Gaza over the last 20 years, there seems to be a common baseline of, if the security issues are addressed in a sustainable, credible manner, particularly after October 7th, um, there really is no philosophical opposition that Israel has to letting Gaza prosper and develop, which to me in
Yeah.
turn means if Gaza's not solved, there is no resolution to any of the conflict. If Gaza isn't proven as a compelling example of effective self-governance and an example of what an occupation-free West Bank can and should look like, military occupation-free West Bank can and should look like, there really is nothing. We're not going to ever win over the trust of the Israeli public, the general public, to help reverse that rightward shift that
You're
has
right. And
occurred.
I think as we wrap up, the two things I think I'd like to focus on this, you also look, Israel's got to pick up the mantle as well. They've really got to step up. That's why I reference a Lapid comment, because you can't just be intransigent forever. If there really is an opportunity here, you've got to pick it up. And I think that comes with directness, yes, caution, but also empathy. Because I think that's what a lot of people in Israel are calling for. It's security with empathy. So help us with that feeling, because what I want to wrap up with is you have criticized also the kind of more publicly declared civilian elements, non-Hamas elements that are supposed to now be in charge or oversee the large munitions and the weapons. Help us understand how that will create, even if there's caution, how will that structure create a disarmed Hamas worthy of trust?
Well, I mean, I myself, I'm still not that trusting of Hamas. I don't, that's not the goal per se. The goal is threefold. Number one is to hold Hamas accountable, to not let this be something exclusively up to Hamas as far as the implementation, to to have this be a multilateral effort whereby Hamas is no longer the sole operator in Gaza, the sole, as going back to my book, Hamas and its 2 million hostages. The people of Gaza need, people talk about liberation from it. Well, I talk about freedom, okay? Because I don't want to be liberated from Israel only to be under the gun and the boot of a jihadi fascist organization like Hamas. And so I think my concern is that the Board of Peace and the technocratic committee, they've not really shown because of some of the chaotic tendencies within the Trump administration, because of some of the lack of funding, the distraction with the war with Iran, they haven't really shown the kind of infrastructure, the kind of the technocrats are stuck in a hotel in Cairo, and they haven't been talking to the Palestinian people. They haven't been messaging. They've just been producing these carefully controlled, Facebook posts or Twitter posts. We had a meeting with so and so to talk about Gaza's future. We haven't seen really compelling messaging of this is what we want to do. This is our agenda. This is how we're going to elevate a new professional class that's not factional, that's not PA, that's not Fatah, that's not Hamas, that's not Islamic Jihad, which, by the way, Islamic Jihad and other factions did sign on to the principle of this agreement because you can't have Hamas disarm, but not the other groups. So, and most of these groups really live in the shadows of Hamas. Hamas is able to impose what it wants upon all of them. Then the next element is that I worry about the prospect of disarmament that simply ushers in kind of like a just a sterile like reconstruction effort. Okay, we're gonna come in, we're gonna clean up the rubble, we're gonna do like that's important. We need reconstruction, but Gaza needs to be reconstituted. Gaza needs to be regenerated. Gaza needs to be reimagined. And some of that will entail the de-radicalization, which gets a bad rep because it's often applied as a word, as a concept in a counterterrorism context. But I use around, instead of de-radicalization, I always couple de-radicalization with its transformation. De-radicalization as a tool for transformation, as a positive empowerment away from a limited worldview, a limited perspective, and one where and one where the prospects and the horizons are infinitely more promising and open. That's how I frame de-radicalization rather than kind of this outside imposed, like, oh, your curriculum, oh, your religion, oh, like the way you talk, oh, like you radical things. Let me just impose upon you all of these foreign ideas, and you need to adopt them for your own good. To be clear, we need to do something about the mosques in Gaza because they're not houses of worships. They're houses of incitement and weapon storages and just a mutation of what Islam is supposed to be under Hamas. We need to do something about not so much that I don't believe it's so much the curriculum as much as it's the editorializing by teachers and classrooms. Because you can have the lesson plan, most of the curriculums, with a few cosmetic changes here and there, they're funded by the Europeans and by the Western governments. They're not going to fund, there's nothing that I learned or that my nieces and nephews have learned that says, kill the Jews, jihadi this, jihadi that. There are references to martyrdom, there's references to this, the naming of streets, the naming of places, the naming of roundabouts. Like there's things throughout society, in education, in religion, in public life that can and should be changed. There are things about engaging with Jews and Israelis, the normalization. There's unleashing the potentiality for what people say behind closed doors, slowly that coming out to the public and being, you know what? I want to go to Tel Aviv and meet Israelis. I want to go to the Gaza envelope that Hamas attacked and brutalized and build relationships and have healing sessions with fellow Israelis. I want to actually have some of the agricultural lands in Gaza revived by working with fellow Israelis and not have that be viewed as, oh my God, you're betraying, the Nakba and our history, or you're betraying, the memory of the thousands that have been killed in this war. So that is my hope, is that in order for this to be transformative and trustworthy as a process, as a pathway, it cannot just be it needs to start as a transactional. Hamas disarms 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here's the families disarm, Islamic Jihad, and then Israel pulls back gradually. It's very transactional, matter of fact, tit for tat. Okay, fine. But what it really needs to trigger and unleash is a process, a pathway, a wave of de-radicalization, of inspiration, of rejuvenation, of a renaissance to change the narrative. The narrative warfare is just as important as the humanitarian front, as the geopolitical front, and as the kind of the media, the war of words that Hamas is using to try to couch this as if it's not a total defeat, if it's not a total surrender. The narrative of this represents the end of a dark era for Gaza, the end of an arc for an Islamist group that just repeated. I'll close with this. It's like we've tried the resistance of the Arab revolt in the 30s and 40s, and even having the pan-Arabism of Nasser in the 50s, the pan-nationalism that started the PLO in the 60s, the Marxist-Leninism in the 70s, and the PFLP that was supported by the Soviet Union, and the hijacking of aircraft and airplane. And then there's the pan-Islamism of Hamas, and that began in the 80s. So all of these different ideologies, but the same outcome related to the armed resistance narrative, which is more loss of life, more loss of land, more loss of opportunity. Israel is stronger than ever. The Palestinian people's national project is weaker than ever, is facing more roadblocks than ever. So that's where I hope that this is the final ism that we try for ideologies. I mean, that's a lot of ideologies we've been cycling through for 80, 90 years right now. And I'm like, this is the time to move away from the resistance narrative towards the nation building narrative in pursuit of peace and coexistence as the ultimate enablers of Palestinian freedom and emancipation.
Amazing point to put on the end, and I always appreciate a good history lesson to end a podcast. Look, we move, I think, from folks like yourself that have been preaching for a new pathway to a moment where you described it, there may actually be a new pathway. Not a solution that's ready to go, all set, but a pathway. And one, I think that's worthy of optimism itself. And what we try to do at JCRC is both be optimistic for a better future, but also add layers to stories and narratives so that people have a deeper understanding. This is not a black and white situation. This is not, hey, great, we have a deal ready to go. It is complicated, and you have helped shed light on the complications, the layers, the many facets of what needs to happen. But let's end there, that this is a remarkable, it could be a brighter future based on this remarkable moment. And we'll just have to wait and see.
Inshallah, fingers crossed. And I'd love to follow up in the near future, maybe in a few months, to see where things are at and kind of touch base on how this year is wrapping up.
Appreciate it. Appreciate you joining us. Appreciate your time. Always appreciate your insight. Ahmed Al Khatib, thanks so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for talking to me. Always a pleasure.